Somewhere, beneath the warm hum of oil lamps, a cup is being poured in ancient Rome. Slow and unremarkable. If a slow night like this is what you needed, a quiet like helps this find its way to someone else who needs it too. And if you're settling in, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. It's nice to know who's out there in the dark with me. Before we begin, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let everything else wait until morning. Number 1. Poisoning as a family business. In ancient Rome, poisoning was so common and so difficult to trace that it became something close to an accepted method of resolving inheritance disputes. The historian Tacitus and others recorded a steady stream of suspicious deaths among the wealthy, husbands, stepsons, elderly relatives with inconvenient wills. Poison was quiet. It left no wounds, and Roman medicine had no reliable way to detect it in a body. By the 1st century, the problem had grown so severe that professional poisoners operated something like a guild. The most notorious was a woman named Locusta, who built a career supplying poison to the imperial family itself. She was reportedly hired to kill the Emperor Claudius, and later to kill his son Britannicus, allegedly on behalf of Nero. Rather than being punished for these acts, Locusta was rewarded, given land, students to train, and imperial protection, at least for a time. What made this possible, historians note, was less a lack of morality and more a lack of forensic science. Without toxicology, a sudden death from poison looked much like death from illness. A family could remove an unwanted heir, and society would simply record it as fever, or bad food, or the will of the gods. It was not until centuries later, with the development of chemical testing, that poisoning stopped being a quiet, almost respectable crime and became something detectives could actually prove. Number 2. Selling unwanted children. In ancient Rome, a father held a legal power known as patria potestas, and among its many provisions was the right to sell his own children into slavery, if he judged it necessary. This was not some rare, scandalous exception. It was simply written into the structure of Roman family law, treated as an ordinary extension of a father's authority over his household. A newborn, in particular, existed in a strange legal limbo. Immediately after birth, the infant was placed on the ground before the father, and it was his decision alone whether to lift the child up, accepting it into the family, or to leave it lying there, a gesture that meant rejection. A rejected infant could be exposed, abandoned at a rubbish heap or crossroads, or sold outright to someone else. Poor families sometimes sold children simply because they could not afford to feed them, while others did so as a way of settling debts. The law even allowed a father to sell the same child up to 3 times before that power was finally exhausted, a detail that reveals just how routine the practice must have been, since lawmakers evidently felt the need to plan for repetition. Buyers of these children were often looking for laborers, servants, or in some cases for infants to raise as their own. There was no stigma attached to the father for doing this, no criminal record, no shame recorded in the surviving sources. It was simply an accepted use of paternal power, one small piece of a much larger legal architecture that gave the male head of a household near total control over everyone living under his roof. Number 3. Public execution as entertainment. In ancient Rome, watching a person die was not considered shocking or transgressive. It was considered a perfectly ordinary afternoon out. The amphitheater was where families gathered, where vendors sold snacks, where the mood was closer to a sporting event than to what modern audiences would associate with the taking of a human life. Condemned criminals were sometimes forced to reenact mythological stories as part of their execution, dressed as legendary figures before being killed in ways that mimicked the myth itself. Other prisoners were simply thrown to wild animals, a practice known as damnatio ad bestias, and the crowd was expected to enjoy it as spectacle rather than recoil from it as cruelty. Seating was arranged by social class, with the wealthiest citizens closest to the action. suggesting that proximity to violent death was treated almost as a privilege rather than something to be shielded from. Children attended alongside their parents. There was no sense that this required protection from young eyes, because nothing about it was considered morally troubling within the framework of the time. Roman writers rarely paused to question the ethics of the practice at all. Their surviving accounts focus instead on the skill of the fighters, the drama of the staging, or the generosity of whichever official had paid for the games. That absence of moral commentary is, in its own way, one of the more telling details historians point to. It suggests that cruelty, when normalized by an entire culture, does not need to be defended. It simply needs to be unremarkable. Number 4. Lead-sweetened wine. In ancient Rome, wine was often made sweeter and more pleasant by boiling grape juice down into a thick syrup called defrutum, or a further reduced version called sapa. The trouble was in how it was made. Roman cooks typically boiled the juice in lead-lined pots, or pots made of lead outright, because lead reacted with the acids in the grape juice to produce a compound with a distinctly sweet taste, one that no other cooking vessel could replicate quite so cheaply. The sweetener produced this way, lead acetate, was so pleasant on the palate that Romans nicknamed it sugar of lead. Centuries before anyone understood what it actually was, it found its way into wine, into preserved fruits, into sauces served at banquets across the empire. Wealthy households, who could afford wine flavored and preserved this way as a matter of daily habit, likely consumed far more of it than the poor, who drank wine cut with water and little else. Modern toxicologists studying Roman skeletal remains have found lead levels dramatically higher than in populations before or after. Some historians have gone so far as to suggest that chronic lead exposure among the Roman elite may have contributed to the fertility problems, stillbirths, and erratic behavior recorded among certain emperors and senators, though this remains debated rather than settled fact. What is certain is that a substance now recognized as a dangerous neurotoxin was, for centuries, considered a refined culinary secret, deliberately added to make food and drink taste better. Number 5. The public latrines were a social hangout in ancient Rome. Communal latrines were not private facilities at all, but long stone benches with rows of keyhole-shaped openings cut side by side, with no partitions between them. A visitor might sit shoulder to shoulder with a dozen strangers, all facing one another, conversing about politics or business while attending to bodily functions in full view. Privacy, as a concept tied to this particular act, simply did not exist in the Roman mind the way it exists today. Beneath the benches ran a channel of flowing water, used to rinse a shared sponge on a stick, known as a tersorium, which was passed from user to user and dipped in vinegar or salt water between uses. There was no individual paper, no disposable cloth, only this single communal tool, cleaned and reused by whoever sat down next. Some of these latrines were attached to bathhouses and became genuine gathering spots, where wealthy citizens might linger to talk rather than rush away. Doctors and philosophers of the era even debated whether the fumes rising from the sewers below posed a danger, though little was done about it, beyond the occasional statue of a protective deity placed near the entrance for good measure. Number 6. Buying a bride at 7. In ancient Rome, it was entirely legal and socially unremarkable for a girl as young as 12 to be married, and betrothals themselves could be arranged for children as young as 7 years old. Roman law set 12 as the minimum age for a girl's marriage to be considered valid. But the engagement, the formal promise between families, required no minimum age at all. Fathers negotiated these unions as practical alliances, weaving together property, political favor, and family reputation, with the bride's own preference treated as a minor consideration at best. The wedding itself often took place the moment the girl reached that legal threshold, meaning many Roman women entered marriage and the household duties that came with it before what would now be considered even the earliest years of adolescence. Grooms, by contrast, were typically men in their 20s or older, having already established a career and finished military service. This gap in age and experience was not seen as troubling. It was simply the expected shape of a Roman household, mirrored in law, in poetry, and in the funerary inscriptions that record wives who died shockingly young. Roman writers occasionally noted the burden this placed on very young brides, but rarely questioned the custom itself. It was, to them, simply how a family secured its future. Number 7. Wealthy Romans keeping human furniture. In the villas of the Roman elite, it was not unusual for a household to include enslaved people whose sole function was to serve, quite literally, as pieces of furniture. A slave might crouch on all fours for hours beneath a dining table, serving as a footstool for a reclining guest during a banquet. Others stood motionless, holding torches or trays for the length of an entire evening, expected to remain still and silent regardless of fatigue, treated less as people than as fixtures of the room. Some wealthy households went further, keeping enslaved children as ornamental attendants, known as delicia, prized for being small, pretty, and amusing, dressed in fine clothing and paraded at gatherings purely for the visual pleasure of guests. Their presence was considered a mark of taste and prosperity, no different in principle from displaying a fine mosaic or an imported marble bust. Roman writers occasionally commented on the practice, but almost always in terms of the furniture's quality or the guest's comfort, not the humanity of the person providing it. Seneca, in fact, was among the few voices of his era to write with genuine unease about how casually his peers treated the enslaved people around them, though his objections were the exception rather than the rule. For most Romans, a human being kneeling under a table was simply part of how a proper dinner party was arranged, as unremarkable as the couches or the wine. Number 8. Vomiting to keep eating. In ancient Rome, wealthy hosts sometimes provided a separate room called a vomitorium in popular imagination. Though historians now agree that word actually referred to the exit passages of amphitheaters, not a dining chamber, still, the practice behind the myth was real enough. At long, extravagant banquets, guests who wished to continue eating after they were full would sometimes step aside, induce vomiting, and return to the table to resume the meal. Seneca the Younger wrote with open disgust about Romans who, in his words, vomited so that they might eat, and ate so that they might vomit, describing it as a symptom of a society drowning in its own excess. This wasn't a universal daily habit among ordinary Romans, who mostly ate simple grain, vegetables, and occasional meat. It was very specifically a marker of elite decadence, tied to multi-course feasts that could stretch for many hours and include dozens of dishes. Physicians of the era, including Galen, discussed vomiting as a medical practice too, recommended for digestive health or after suspected poisoning, blurring the line between banquet excess and accepted medical treatment. To Roman moralists, the habit became a favorite symbol in speeches and satire, a shorthand for how far the aristocracy had drifted from the frugal, disciplined ideals the Republic once claimed to admire. Number 9. Buying a place in the theater with a coin from the drain. Roman urine, oddly enough, was considered a valuable commodity, collected in public and private latrines, and sold to laundries and tanneries across the city. Full ones, the Roman launderers, used it as a cleaning agent, since the ammonia it contained was remarkably effective at removing grease and whitening wool togas. Workers would stand ankle-deep in vats of diluted urine, treading fabric underfoot for hours, much like grapes in a winepress. The trade was so lucrative that the Emperor Vespasian, in the 1st century AD, placed a tax on the collection of urine from public latrines, a move that scandalized some senators as beneath the dignity of the state. When his own son Titus objected to profiting from something so undignified, Vespasian reportedly held up a coin earned from the tax and asked whether it smelled of anything at all. It did not. And the phrase pecunia non olet, money does not smell, was born from that exchange, still quoted centuries later as a shorthand for the idea that profit erases the origin of the coin that carries it. Public urinals themselves became small profit centers, with collectors, called silicariae in some accounts, competing over the richest, most concentrated sources, since older, more fermented urine was considered more effective for laundering. What seems, today, like an obviously unsanitary transaction was, in Rome, simply an efficient use of a resource nobody wanted to waste, folded quietly into the machinery of a functioning economy. Number 10. Gladiator blood as medicine. In ancient Rome, it was not unusual for spectators to leave the amphitheater, carrying more than memories of the games. Physicians of the era, including the well-documented Pliny the Elder, recorded that the blood of slain gladiators was collected and sold as a remedy for epilepsy. The condition, then called the sacred disease, because its seizures seemed to defy ordinary explanation, had no understood cause or cure. So sufferers turned to whatever promised relief, and warm gladiator blood, drunk fresh at the edge of the arena, was widely believed to transfer the fighter's vitality directly into the patient's body. Vendors reportedly did brisk business immediately after fatal bouts, timing their sales to the moment a body was still warm. Some accounts describe the liver of a fallen gladiator being eaten raw for the same purpose, on the theory that courage and strength were physical substances that could be consumed like nourishment. Roman medical thinking at the time did not draw a firm line between magic and science. Blood, in particular, was thought to carry a person's essential force, so drinking it from someone who had died fighting bravely seemed, to many, like sound practical logic rather than superstition. The practice persisted for centuries and even outlasted gladiatorial combat itself in certain corners of the Roman world, with later writers noting that executed criminals' blood was sometimes substituted once the games declined. Modern medicine would recognize none of this as remotely effective, and the notion of drinking human blood as a public health measure would today trigger both criminal charges and a public health investigation. In Rome, it was simply another transaction at the edge of the sand, unremarkable enough to be noted only in passing by the naturalists who happened to be watching. Number 11. Paying with human urine. In ancient Rome, urine was not treated as mere waste, but as a genuinely valuable commodity, collected daily from public latrines and from large ceramic pots left on street corners for passers-by to use. Fullers, the tradesmen responsible for cleaning and whitening woolen togas, relied on it constantly, since the ammonia within aged urine acted as an effective cleaning agent and bleaching solvent. Workers would pour collected urine into vats, then stand knee-deep in the mixture, treading fabric much like grapes were pressed for wine. The trade grew so lucrative that collectors would fight over prime collection spots, and haulers made regular rounds through the city, gathering it from taverns and homes. Urine was also used in early dental care, with some Romans reportedly rinsing their mouths with it, believing the ammonia helped whiten teeth. So embedded was this economy that when Emperor Vespasian imposed his famous tax on its collection, no one seriously questioned the logic. Only the smell, which, as history remembers, apparently did not matter at all when the coin landed in hand. Number 12. Renting out enslaved bodies for profit. In ancient Rome, it was entirely ordinary for a slave owner to rent out the people they enslaved for physical labor, entertainment, or even sexual use, treating the human body as a piece of income-generating property, no different from a cart or a plot of farmland. Inscriptions and legal texts from the period describe enslaved people being leased to brothel keepers, to mining operations, to wealthy households needing extra hands for a single evening's banquet. The arrangement was purely contractual between the owner and whoever paid for the use of that person's labor or body, with the enslaved individual having no say in the transaction whatsoever. Roman law treated this as a straightforward property matter, and jurists spent considerable energy debating not the ethics of the practice, but rather technical questions, such as who was liable if a rented slave was injured or died while under someone else's temporary control. Brothels in particular relied heavily on this rental system, with some enslaved women and men effectively belonging to syndicates of investors who split the profits of their labor. There were even recorded cases of owners insuring their human property against death or damage while it was out on loan, treating a person, quite literally, as a financial asset to be protected. The practice was so unremarkable that it barely drew comment from Roman writers, who reserved their moral outrage for other matters entirely. Number 13. Branding runaway slaves. In ancient Rome, an enslaved person who attempted to escape and was later recaptured could be legally and permanently marked as punishment. This often took the form of a hot iron brand applied to the forehead, sometimes spelling out letters such as F for fugitivus, meaning runaway, or an abbreviated phrase warning others against harboring the person again. The mark was meant to be read at a glance, a permanent notice stitched into human skin. Some enslaved people were instead forced to wear an iron collar riveted shut around the neck, engraved with instructions for whoever might find them wandering. One surviving collar, now kept in a museum in Rome, reads roughly as an order to return the wearer to his master for a reward, along with the owner's name and address. It was, in effect, a lost and found tag welded onto a human being. This practice was not hidden or shameful by Roman standards. It was administrative. Slave traders and owners considered a branded or collared runaway less valuable on resale, which occasionally made buyers negotiate lower prices, specifically because the marking reduced the person's usefulness as unblemished property. The scars were, quite literally, priced. Roman law even addressed disputes over these markings directly, with jurists debating whether a seller who failed to disclose a slave's history of running away had committed fraud. The branding itself raised no such legal concern. What mattered legally was whether the mark had been properly disclosed in the sale, not whether it should have existed at all. Number 14. The sale of infant blood as a cure. In ancient Rome, epilepsy was known as morbus comedialis, the disease of the assembly, because a seizure occurring during a public meeting was considered such an ill omen that the proceedings would be canceled on the spot. The medical understanding of the condition was almost non-existent, so Romans turned to folk remedies that ranged from strange to genuinely horrifying. Pliny the Elder, writing in his Natural History, recorded that some sufferers drank the warm blood of dying gladiators, believing that a violent death released a kind of vital force that could be absorbed by another. But adult blood was not the only substance believed to hold healing power. Pliny also noted, with visible discomfort in his own writing, that some Romans consumed the blood of infants, or even parts of a child's liver, in the hope of curing epileptic seizures. He described the practice as a horror, distancing himself from it even as he documented it as something that occurred. There was no formal industry built around this the way there was around gladiator remedies sold outside the arena. It seems to have existed at the margins, whispered about rather than advertised, practiced by the desperate rather than the fashionable. Roman medicine at the time offered almost nothing in the way of actual treatment for seizure disorders, and in the absence of understanding, sympathetic magic filled the gap. The logic was consistent with much of Roman folk healing. Blood was thought to carry life force, and a life taken young was imagined to carry more of it. It is a detail that says less about cruelty for its own sake and more about how far people will reach when medicine has nothing else to offer them. Number 15. Selling teeth from the dead. In ancient Rome, dentistry was a rudimentary and often desperate affair, and one of its stranger byproducts was a quiet trade in human teeth harvested from corpses. Roman writers describe dental workers, and sometimes battlefield scavengers, pulling teeth from the dead to be fitted into the mouths of the living. A person who had lost teeth to decay, injury, or old age might pay to have a replacement wired into place, often carved from ivory or bone, but sometimes taken directly from a cadaver whose teeth were simply healthier than their own. The practice was not hidden or shameful in the way it might seem now. Etruscan dental work centuries earlier had already normalized the idea of gold bridges and replacement teeth, and Romans inherited both the technology and the casual attitude toward its materials. Battlefields were considered a particularly convenient source, since young soldiers tended to have strong, undamaged teeth, and the dead had little further use for them. Some historians even suggest a grim incentive existed for looters who stripped fallen soldiers not just of armor and coin, but of their smiles. There was no framework resembling consent, no question of where a tooth had come from before it ended up in someone else's jaw. It was simply spare biological material, repurposed the way one might reuse a piece of metal or wood. The line between the living and the dead, in this narrow corner of Roman life, was remarkably thin. Number 16. The child astrologer's curse. In ancient Rome, casting a horoscope for the emperor was, at various points, an offense punishable by death. It sounds like a strange crime to legislate against, but the logic followed a very real fear. If an astrologer could calculate when an emperor might die, that knowledge became dangerous currency. Several emperors, including Tiberius and later Domitian, expelled astrologers from Italy entirely, only to quietly keep favored ones close at court for their own private consultations. The hypocrisy was widely known and rarely discussed openly. What made the practice especially perilous was how easily it could be turned into an accusation. A senator suspected of disloyalty might be condemned not for any plot, but simply because a horoscope was found among his papers, one that mapped his own future rule. Owning such a document, even out of idle curiosity, could be read as an admission of ambition. Tacitus records numerous trials where the mere presence of astrological charts became the central evidence against the accused. Mathematici, as these astrologers were called, moved through Roman society as both trusted advisors and potential liabilities, sought out in private, denounced in public. Their predictions shaped marriages, military campaigns, and successions, yet the practitioners themselves lived under the constant possibility of banishment or execution, depending entirely on whose future they had dared to calculate. Number 17. Renting out a wet nurse's milk. In ancient Rome, breastfeeding was rarely handled by the mother herself, if the family had any wealth at all. Infants of the elite were routinely handed over to wet nurses, enslaved or freeborn poor women, whose milk was treated as a commodity to be evaluated, priced, and contracted. Roman medical writers, including Soranus of Ephesus, wrote detailed guidelines on how to select a proper wet nurse, examining the color of her milk, the firmness of her breasts, even her temperament, since it was widely believed that a nurse's character passed to the infant through her milk. A bad-tempered nurse, some physicians warned, might produce a bad-tempered child. Contracts survive from Roman Egypt, specifying the exact duration of a wet nurse's service, often 2 full years, along with penalties if she failed to produce enough milk or secretly nursed another child on the side. Wet nurses were sometimes shared or lent between households, moved from one wealthy family's nursery to another, almost like reusable equipment. For enslaved women who served as wet nurses, there was rarely any choice in the matter at all. Their bodies and their milk belonged legally to someone else. Some of these women formed lasting bonds with the children they raised, and Roman funerary inscriptions occasionally honor a beloved nurse with real tenderness. But the arrangement itself, a woman's biology treated as a leasable resource for another family's convenience, was simply how Roman domestic life functioned, unremarked upon in any surviving source as anything unusual. Number 18. The trade in exposed infants. In ancient Rome, unwanted newborns were not always killed outright. Fathers who chose not to raise a child, whether for reasons of poverty, deformity, or simply the wrong sex, could have the infant carried out and left at a rubbish heap, a crossroads, or a designated column near the vegetable market. a practice historians now call infant exposure. What happened next was not always death, though many infants did not survive the exposure itself. Slave traders and brothel keepers were known to patrol these sites specifically, collecting abandoned babies to raise as future slaves or prostitutes. A child left to die by one household might, days later, be very much alive and already someone else's legal property. Roman law treated this as unremarkable. There was no crime in exposing a child, and no crime in picking one up afterward. The Roman jurist Justinian's later compilations even preserve earlier rulings debating whether a father retained any claim over a child he had once abandoned. Should that child later be found and raised by someone else? Mostly, the answer was no. Abandonment severed the bond entirely. Some infants were more fortunate. Wealthier families without children of their own sometimes took in exposed babies informally, raising them as their own without any legal adoption process. Since Roman adoption law was designed for transferring grown sons between elite households, not for absorbing foundlings, these informal arrangements left almost no paper trail, which means the true scale of infant exposure in Rome is something historians can only estimate from scattered letters, legal commentary, and the occasional grim aside in a philosopher's writing. A letter survives from a Roman man named Hilarion, writing to his pregnant wife back home while working away in Alexandria. He instructed her plainly that if the child was a boy, to keep it, and if a girl, to expose it. The letter is often cited precisely because of how ordinary its tone is, a household instruction, filed among requests about wages and errands, with no sense that anything unusual was being asked at all. Number 19. The wine of vinegar and water. In the camps and countryside of the Roman world, ordinary soldiers and laborers rarely drank the fine, aged wines praised by poets. Instead, they drank pasca, a thin, sour mixture of vinegar and water, sometimes flavored with a few herbs or a splash of cheap wine gone half to acid. It was cheap, it kept without spoiling in the heat, and it was believed to ward off dysentery and thirst better than plain water drawn from questionable sources. Roman legions were issued pasca as a matter of course, and generals like Hadrian reportedly drank it themselves as a display of shared hardship with their troops. It was, in effect, the standard issue beverage of the Roman military machine, consumed daily by men who marched 20 miles carrying 60 pounds of gear. Today, no employer would hand workers a ration of diluted vinegar and call it hydration and morale management. But for centuries, pasca was simply what a Roman soldier drank, at breakfast, at the midday halt, and again at the end of a day's march, without complaint, because there was nothing in. Number 20. The Murmillo's mirror. In Roman gladiatorial contests, a fighter's death was rarely left to chance, or to the shouted verdict of the crowd alone. When a combatant fell wounded and unable to continue, an attendant dressed as Charon, ferryman of the underworld, or sometimes as Mercury, guide of souls, stepped into the arena carrying a heavy mallet. This figure would strike the fallen man across the head, or press a hot iron to his flesh, a grim confirmation that he was truly dead and not merely feigning collapse to avoid a killing blow. The practice existed because faking death was a known trick among gladiators desperate to survive, and audiences had grown wary of being cheated out of the spectacle they paid to see. Once confirmed dead, the body was dragged out through the Porta Libitinensis, the gate of death, named for Libitina, the Roman goddess associated with funerals. Attendants working under contract, often the same men who ran the city's undertaking business, hauled the corpse away on hooks to a nearby room where its throat might be cut as one final precaution. This entire ritual, mallet and mask included, was choreographed as fluidly as the fight itself, a piece of theater that Romans watched without flinching, understanding it simply as due diligence before the next pair of fighters entered the sand. Number 21. Renting out gladiators for private murder. In ancient Rome, Wealthy hosts who wanted to impress dinner guests with something memorable could arrange for a private gladiatorial bout to take place inside their own homes, sometimes ending in real death rather than a staged and bloodless demonstration. Day, the men who owned and trained gladiators for profit, ran a business not unlike a modern rental service. Fighters could be hired out for public games, but also for private commissions, whether that meant a birthday celebration, a funeral banquet, or simply an evening meant to establish a host's wealth and daring in front of peers. The practice was expensive, since a lanista lost future earnings on any fighter killed for a single evening's entertainment, and the cost was passed directly onto the host. Roman writers occasionally mention this kind of display with a note of disapproval, framing it as a particularly wasteful and grim form of one-upmanship among the very rich, distinct from the state-sponsored games held for the general public. Unlike the amphitheater, where thousands watched and death served a civic or religious function tied to funerary rites, a private killing performed in someone's dining room existed for no purpose beyond spectacle and status. There was no crowd to appease, no emperor's popularity to secure, no god to honor, only the desire to be talked about the next morning. Some historians argue this practice reveals just how thoroughly violence had become woven into ordinary Roman social life. So ordinary that it could be commissioned the way one might hire musicians or acrobats for a party. A human life, in these arrangements, functioned as a line item in an evening's entertainment budget, negotiated and paid for like any other service. Number 22. Renting out a temple prostitute. In certain corners of the Roman world, particularly in cities with strong ties to Eastern cults, sacred prostitution operated openly as part of temple economy. The most documented example lies not in Rome itself, but in its cultural orbit, in places like Corinth and various shrines dedicated to Venus or her Eastern counterparts, where worshippers could pay a fee that functioned simultaneously as a religious offering and payment for sex. The arrangement was not treated as scandalous within its own context. It was folded into temple finances, with priests or temple administrators overseeing the transactions and taking a portion of the proceeds to maintain the shrine, fund festivals, or support the wider priesthood. A visitor paying for the encounter was, in the logic of the time, making a devotional act, one believed to please the goddess and bring fertility or good fortune. Roman writers themselves were somewhat divided on how to regard the practice. Some viewed it as a foreign custom, faintly exotic and slightly disreputable, associated more with Greek or Near Eastern religion than with proper Roman piety. Others simply recorded it as part of travel writing, mentioning temple courtesans the way one might mention local food or architecture. Roman law did not treat the individuals involved as criminals. If anything, their status was legally similar to other enslaved or freed sex workers, taxed and registered by the state under the same provisions that govern brothels in Roman cities. What made the temple context distinct was the layer of religious legitimacy placed over an arrangement that, stripped of ceremony, was still built on the same foundations as any other exploitation of enslaved or low-status people for profit. The goddess's blessing did not change who was doing the labor, or who was collecting the money at the end of the day. Number 23. The Vestal Virgin's living burial. In ancient Rome, the 6 priestesses, known as the Vestal Virgins, were chosen as young girls, often around the age of 10, to tend the sacred flame of the goddess Vesta for 30 years, sworn to chastity for the duration of their service. Their vow was treated as a matter of state security, since the flame's extinguishing was believed to endanger Rome itself. A Vestal who broke that vow of chastity was not executed by blade or by strangulation, methods considered too direct for someone still technically consecrated to the gods. Instead, the punishment was designed to let the gods decide her fate without any Roman hand directly spilling her blood. The condemned Vestal was carried through the city in a covered litter, sealed so tightly that her cries could not be heard, and brought to a place called the Campus Sceleratus, the field of wickedness just inside the city walls. There, a small underground chamber had been prepared, furnished with a bed, a lamp, and a little bread, water, milk, and oil, enough that no one could say she had been directly starved. She descended a ladder into the chamber. The ladder was withdrawn. Earth was piled over the opening until the space was sealed completely, and the priestess was left below ground to die slowly. Unseen and unheard by the public that had once revered her, Roman writers recorded that even hardened crowds found the ritual unbearable to witness, and that the procession was conducted in near silence, as though the city itself were reluctant to acknowledge what it was doing. The man accused alongside her, if there was one, faced a comparatively quick death by public flogging. Over the centuries, only a small number of Vestals are recorded as having suffered this fate, but the punishment endured as a fixture of Roman religious law for hundreds of years, a reminder that the same civilization, capable of extraordinary engineering and philosophy, could also formalize, with careful bureaucratic precision, the quiet burial of a living woman. Number 24. The blood of executed criminals as a spectacle prop. In Roman arenas, the bodies of condemned criminals were not simply removed once execution had run its course. During the midday intermissions of the games, when the morning's beast hunts had ended and the afternoon's gladiatorial bouts had not yet begun, convicted criminals were led out and killed by the dozen, often with no weapon in hand to defend themselves at all. Historians describe this middle slot of the day as the least prestigious part of the program, attended mostly by those who stayed through lunch rather than leaving the stands, and yet it was treated as ordinary scheduled programming, printed into the rhythm of the day, the way a scene change might be today. Some were forced into elaborate stage scenarios, drawn from mythology, dressed as legendary figures, and killed in ways that mimic the myth's ending exactly. A man might be burned alive, playing Hercules on a pyre, or mauled while costumed as Orpheus, surrounded by animals that had been trained, or simply starved to attack. Roman writers occasionally noted the artistry of these deaths with something close to admiration for the staging, rather than any horror at the killing itself. The condemned were, in the eyes of Roman law, already stripped of the protections given to citizens, which meant their deaths could be shaped into entertainment, without any legal or moral objection ever needing to be raised. Number 25. Public bathing with everyone. In Roman cities, public bathhouses were not quiet, private places, but loud communal spaces where hundreds of strangers soaked together in the same unfiltered water. The famous baths of Caracalla could hold over 1,000 bathers at once, moving between chambers of increasing heat, and the water itself was rarely changed with any regularity that modern hygiene would recognize. People with skin conditions, open wounds, or infectious illnesses bathed in the same pools as everyone else, since there was no medical understanding of germs or contagion to suggest otherwise. Physicians of the era, including Celsus, occasionally noted that bathhouses seemed connected to the spread of certain ailments, but the observation rarely changed behavior. Men and women sometimes bathed together, depending on the city, the era, and the specific establishment, and moralists periodically complained about the mixed nudity as a sign of declining virtue. Entry cost only a small coin, making the baths one of the few truly democratic spaces in Roman society, where a senator and a shopkeeper might soak in the same murky pool without much comment. It was less a place of hygiene in the modern sense, and more a social institution, a place to gossip, do business, and be seen, with cleanliness almost a secondary benefit of the visit. Number 26. Buying a wife's dowry back through divorce. In ancient Rome, marriage was, at its legal core, a financial arrangement between families, and divorce was strikingly easy to obtain compared to almost every society that followed it. Either spouse could end a marriage simply by declaring the intention in front of witnesses, with no court approval, no waiting period, and often no formal reason required at all. A husband might send a freed woman or slave to deliver the message, A wife, if she came from a family of standing, could do the same. What made this especially transactional was the dowry, the sum of money or property a bride's family handed over at marriage. Roman law treated the dowry as something that had to be tracked, negotiated, and, upon divorce, largely returned. Fathers and husbands haggled over how much of it would go back, sometimes deducting portions for perceived misconduct or for children born during the marriage. Lawyers of the era, including Cicero, wrote about dowry disputes with the same dry precision used for property lawsuits. Because of this, marriages among the elite were remade constantly for political and financial advantage. A woman might marry, divorce, and remarry 2 or 3 times in a decade, each shift realigning alliances between powerful families. Cato the Younger famously divorced his wife Marcia so that his friend Hortensius could marry her, then remarried her himself after Hortensius died and left her his fortune. Nobody involved seemed to consider this scandalous. It was simply how influence moved through Roman society, one carefully renegotiated contract at a time. Number 27. The sale of foundling citizenship. In Rome, a citizen's legal status was not always something fixed at birth and left untouched. It could, in certain cases, be manufactured, bought, or quietly falsified through the right connections and enough money changing hands. Roman citizenship carried enormous practical value: lighter taxation in the provinces, protection from certain forms of torture and summary execution, the right to appeal a magistrate's judgment directly to Rome, because the empire stretched across so many peoples who did not hold this status. Forging or purchasing proof of it became a quiet trade of its own. Officials responsible for maintaining citizen registries, especially in provincial towns far from the capital, were sometimes bribed to insert a name into the rolls, or to issue documentation attesting that someone had been born free to citizen parents when no such birth had occurred. The Book of Acts even preserves an exchange in which a Roman military officer admits he purchased his citizenship for a considerable sum, while the man he is questioning states plainly that his own citizenship came by birth. A small but telling detail suggesting the practice was ordinary enough to mention without shock. For wealthy freedmen or ambitious provincials, buying a falsified record of citizenship was simply a business transaction, one more expense on the path toward social advancement. Getting caught, however, was a different matter entirely, since impersonating a citizen falsely was itself treated as a serious offense against the state. Number 28. Paid mourners at funerals. In ancient Rome, grief itself could be hired for the day. Wealthy families arranged for professional mourners, called praeficae, to walk in funeral processions, tearing at their hair, scratching their cheeks, and wailing loudly for a crowd of strangers to hear. These women were not relatives. They were contracted specialists, often older and experienced in the trade, paid specifically for the volume and conviction of their sorrow. The more prominent the deceased, the more mourners a family hired, since a large, loud procession signaled status as much as any marble tomb or inscribed epitaph. Some praefica even led ritual songs called nania, chanted laments praising the dead in exaggerated, formulaic verse, sometimes composed on the spot for a fee. Musicians often accompanied them, flutes and horns woven into the procession, turning private loss into a kind of public performance staged along the streets leading to the tomb. Roman moralists occasionally sneered at the custom, arguing that true grief needed no audience and certainly no invoice. But for most families, especially those climbing the social ladder, a hired chorus of sorrow was simply part of doing a funeral properly, no different, in their eyes, from hiring musicians for a wedding or caterers for a banquet. Death, like so much else in Roman life, had its own visible economy, and mourning was simply one more service that could be bought, rehearsed, and performed on schedule. Number 29. Buying a magistrate's vote. In the last century of the Republic, Roman elections had become a marketplace, as much as a civic ritual. Candidates for office openly distributed money to voters through intermediaries known as divisors, men who moved through the tribes on election day, handing out coins in exchange for a promised vote. The practice was called ambitus, and it was, in principle, illegal. Laws against it were passed again and again, each one more severe than the last, which itself suggests how rarely they worked. Wealthy candidates, like Julius Caesar, borrowed staggering sums to fund these campaigns. Understanding that a praetorship or consulship, once won, could be used to recoup the debt many times over through provincial governorships, rich with opportunities for extraction and bribery. Cicero himself, prosecuting and defending ambitus cases throughout his career, described a political culture where feasts, gifts, and cash were simply how ambitious men built support. Being caught could mean exile or the loss of one's citizenship, yet the practice persisted openly for generations, because everyone standing for office needed it, and everyone judging the offense had likely benefited from it too. By the time of Augustus, the old electoral assemblies had lost most of their real power anyway, and the emperor's favor mattered far more than any voter's coin. The bribery didn't vanish so much as it moved upward, concentrated now in the quiet transactions of imperial patronage, rather than the noisy crowds. Number 30, cursing your enemies with lead tablets. In the Roman world, when someone felt wronged by a rival, a thief, or a former lover, one common recourse was not a lawsuit, but a curse. People wrote what are known today as defictions, or curse tablets, thin sheets of lead inscribed with a request to the gods of the underworld to punish a named individual. Thousands of these tablets have survived, buried near graves, thrown into wells, or nailed into the walls of temples, places believed to sit closer to the world of the dead. The language on them is often startlingly specific. A tablet might ask that a rival chariot driver's horses stumble and break their legs, that a business competitor lose his voice in court, or that a departed lover suffer sleeplessness until they return. Some curses target thieves who stole small household items, demanding the gods extract the item's value in blood, health, or suffering if it is not returned. Professional curse writers, familiar with the correct ritual phrasing, could be hired to compose them, much like scribes drafting legal contracts. What makes the practice striking is how mainstream it was. This was not fringe sorcery practiced in secret by outcasts. It was a widely used, semi-public tool, employed by ordinary citizens, athletes, and even magistrates. Roman law did periodically try to suppress harmful magic, particularly curses believed capable of causing death. But the sheer volume of surviving tablets suggests enforcement rarely matched the demand. Cursing a rival, in Roman daily life, was simply another way of seeking justice when the courts felt too slow or too uncertain to trust. Number 31. Paid mourners who cursed the dead. In Roman funeral custom, families of sufficient means hired a class of professional women known as praeficae, whose entire function was to grieve loudly and convincingly on command. These women were not relatives and often had no personal connection to the deceased at all. They were contracted, much like musicians or caterers, to lead the funeral procession while tearing their hair, scratching their cheeks, wailing, and singing improvised laments called naniae that praised the dead person's virtues, sometimes inventing accomplishments the person never actually had. What made this practice especially strange to modern sensibilities was its blend of sincerity and theater. Roman audiences understood perfectly well that the praeficae were paid performers, yet the volume and intensity of a funeral's mourning was still read as a direct signal of the family's wealth and social standing. A funeral with only quiet, restrained grief looked poor. A funeral with several loud, professional women shrieking in unison down the street looked prestigious. Grief, in this sense, functioned less as a private emotion and more as a public commodity, purchased and displayed for the benefit of neighbors and rivals watching the procession pass. The satirist Lucian and other Roman writers noted with some cynicism that these hired mourners often recycled the same stock phrases from funeral to funeral, regardless of who had actually died. A merchant, a soldier, or a minor magistrate might receive nearly identical praise delivered with the same rehearsed sobs. Some praeficae were even known to negotiate their fee in advance based on how elaborate or prolonged the performance needed to be, effectively pricing sorrow by the hour. Number 32. Paid mourners' physical performance. Beyond the wailing and the recycled laments, Roman funeral mourners were also expected to perform grief with their bodies, not just their voices. The praeficae, and sometimes other hired women alongside them, would tear at their own hair, scratch their cheeks until they bled, and beat their chests hard enough to leave visible marks. This was not incidental theater. Roman law actually tried to limit it. The 12 Tables, among the earliest Roman legal codes, explicitly restricted women from lacerating their faces at funerals, which tells us the practice was common enough to require legislation against it centuries before these later imperial funerals took place. Wealthier families expected a more dramatic show, and mourners were sometimes paid extra for visible self-harm, since bloodied cheeks and torn clothing were read by onlookers as proof of the household's grief, and, by extension, its importance. Some processions even included mourners who ripped their garments deliberately, letting the fabric hang loose as a visual marker of devastation. Musicians walked alongside them playing tibia pipes, a droning, mournful sound meant to underscore the spectacle, while the mourner's physical anguish became something closer to street performance than private sorrow. A modern observer might see self-inflicted injury and assume a mental health crisis in progress. In Rome, it was simply a line item in a funeral contract, negotiated in advance like the number of musicians or the length of the procession. Number 33. Buying a fake family history. In the city of Rome, ancestry was not simply a matter of pride. It was political currency, and a surprising number of citizens found ways to invent one that never existed. Wax portrait masks called imagines, kept in the halls of noble homes, represented ancestors who had held high office, and families paraded these masks at funerals to display generations of accomplishment. But the system relied almost entirely on trust and paperwork that could be quietly altered. Genealogies were recorded on wax tablets and private household records, not centralized public archives, which meant a wealthy but undistinguished family could, with the right scribe and the right bribe, insert a consul or a war hero into their lineage who had never actually been related to them at all. This mattered enormously because Roman social and political life ran on inherited prestige. A senator's son had an easier path into office than a self-made newcomer, and a manufactured link to an old, respected name could soften the reputation of what the Romans called a homo novus, a new man without ancestral connections. Cicero himself, despite his enormous talent, was mocked throughout his career for lacking noble bloodline, which shows just how much weight genuine ancestry carried and how tempting it must have been for lesser families to simply purchase the appearance of it. Forged genealogies were rarely prosecuted as crimes in the way forged coins or forged wills were, largely because there was no reliable way to disprove a family story once enough time had passed and enough witnesses had died. Some of this fabrication happened at a smaller, quieter scale too. Freedmen, former slaves who had earned or purchased their freedom, sometimes adjusted the details of their own origins once they had money and could not be easily checked, softening a background that Roman aristocrats openly looked down upon. It was, in its own way, an ancient version of identity laundering, done not with documents forged in secret rooms, but with confident storytelling, respected witnesses, and enough generations passing that nobody left alive could say otherwise. Number 34. Buying votes with dinner. In the final decades of the Roman Republic, a political candidate's success often depended less on rhetoric than on the quality of the banquets he could offer. Wealthy office seekers would host lavish public feasts, called convivia, open to entire tribes of voters, sometimes numbering in the thousands. These meals were not subtle gestures of goodwill. They were understood by everyone present as a direct exchange, food and wine in return for a vote on election day. Cicero himself complained about the practice, noting how candidates competed to outspend one another on delicacies and entertainment, simply to keep their names favorable in the minds of the electorate. Some candidates went further, funding elaborate public games or gladiatorial shows timed deliberately close to election season, knowing that a full stomach and a memorable spectacle tended to translate into loyalty at the ballot. Laws attempting to cap the extravagance of these campaign banquets were passed repeatedly, and repeatedly ignored, since the fines were minor compared to the political payoff. By the late Republic, hosting these dinners had become such an expected feature of running for office that a candidate who failed to feed the voters was often assumed to be either too poor to hold power or too arrogant to bother trying. Number 35. Selling your vote for a coin. In the late Roman Republic, the act of a citizen accepting a bribe in exchange for a vote was not treated as a private shame to be hidden, but as an unremarkable transaction woven into the rhythm of election season. Historians note that ordinary voters, particularly members of the poorer urban tribes, came to expect payment simply for showing up and casting a ballot in favor of a given candidate. The going rate fluctuated depending on how contested the race was, and in especially heated consular elections, prices per vote could climb considerably as rival camps tried to outbid one another for the same block of tribal voters. What made this arrangement so durable was the layer of deniability built into the system. Money rarely passed directly from a candidate's hand to a voter's. Instead, it moved through the divisors, professional distributors already mentioned in connection with organized bribery, who kept ledgers, managed cash reserves, and quietly settled accounts after the polls closed. A voter could accept payment, cast a ballot, and still describe himself, without much sense of contradiction, as exercising his rightful civic duty. Cicero himself complained bitterly about the practice in his letters, describing entire tribes as essentially auctioned off during certain elections, their loyalty determined less by policy than by which faction's cash reserves ran deeper that particular year. Laws against this kind of direct vote selling existed on paper for generations, carrying penalties that included fines, loss of political rights, and in some periods even exile. Yet enforcement remained strikingly inconsistent, since the very magistrates responsible for prosecuting bribery often owed their own offices to the same networks of paid support. By the final decades of the Republic, some observers had simply stopped viewing the exchange as corruption in the modern sense at all, treating it instead as one more accepted cost of running for office, no more scandalous than renting a public hall or printing a campaign slogan on a wall. Number 36. Buying your way into office. In the final stretch of a Roman election, a candidate's spending often mattered more than his record. Roman electoral law technically forbade excessive campaign spending, yet magistrates competing for the consulship or praetorship routinely poured personal fortunes into games, feasts, and gifts designed to buy visibility and goodwill in the weeks before voting. Cicero himself, writing about the elections of his era, described candidates borrowing enormous sums from moneylenders simply to fund the spectacle expected of them, betting that the office itself would let them repay those debts later through provincial governorships. That expectation was an open secret. A man who won a praetorship or a consulship in Rome often went on to govern a province, and provincial governorships came with wide, loosely supervised power to tax, requisition goods, and settle legal disputes, power that could be quietly converted into personal profit. So the financial logic of a Roman campaign ran in a complete circle. Borrow heavily to win the office, then use the office to extract wealth from a province, then use that wealth to repay the original loans and fund the next campaign. Roman writers were fully aware of the pattern and complained about it constantly. Yet the system persisted for centuries, because everyone competing for power was playing by the same unofficial rules. Losing an election while deeply in debt could mean financial ruin or exile, which only pushed ambitious men to borrow and spend even more aggressively the next time. It was less an occasional scandal than a fully normalized economic engine sitting underneath the entire Roman political career ladder. Number 37. Provincial extortion trials. Once a Roman politician secured a governorship, the debts of his campaign were rarely far from his mind, and the machinery for repaying them was built directly into the office itself. A governor controlled taxation, legal judgments, and military requisitions across an entire province, and many used that control quite openly to enrich themselves, demanding gifts from local towns, inflating grain requisitions for personal resale, or simply extracting cash under threat of legal trouble. The abuses became so widespread that Rome eventually created a standing court, the Quaestio de Repetundis, specifically to hear extortion cases brought by provincials against former governors. Cicero's prosecution of Gaius Verres, a governor of Sicily accused of looting temples and selling verdicts to the highest bidder, remains the best documented example, largely because Cicero published his speeches even after Verres fled into exile rather than face trial. What the case reveals is less about one corrupt man than about the ordinary expectations of the system around him. Provincial communities understood that a governor's tenure would cost them, and the only real question was how much restraint, if any, he would show. Conviction rates in these extortion courts stayed low for generations, since juries were frequently drawn from the same senatorial class the accused belonged to. For a province, a change of governor was less a change in leadership than a renegotiation of how much would be taken and by whom. Number 38. Buying a court verdict. In Roman courts, it was entirely ordinary for wealthy litigants to pay for the outcome they wanted, rather than trust the process to decide it for them. Jurors in the late Republic were drawn from the senatorial and equestrian classes, and many of them were known to accept money, favors, or promises of future political support in exchange for a favorable vote. There was no secret ballot to protect the process from scrutiny, and no strong tradition treating a juror's vote as something above negotiation. Cicero himself complained openly about juries that could be bought outright, and defendants of sufficient means were widely assumed to have an advantage, regardless of the facts of their case. Advocates sometimes worked as much on securing sympathetic jurors beforehand as on preparing their actual arguments. A skilled Roman lawyer's real value often lay less in eloquence and more in knowing exactly which senator could be persuaded, and for how much. Even the extortion courts, created to punish corrupt governors, were not immune. Trials meant to hold provincial officials accountable could themselves be swayed by bribery, meaning a governor who had already extorted a province might simply spend part of that fortune buying his own acquittal. Roman writers treated this less as scandal and more as an unfortunate, well-known feature of how justice actually worked in practice. Number 39. Buying a magistracy outright. In the final century of the Republic, Roman elections had grown so entangled with money that public offices themselves came to carry something close to a real price. A man seeking the consulship or a praetorship was expected to spend enormous sums simply to be viable, and by the 60s BCE, observers openly discussed what a given magistracy was effectively worth in bribes, banquets, and favors distributed to voters and influential brokers. Cicero, defending clients accused under the anti-bribery statutes, acknowledged in his letters that nearly every recent election involved some illegal payment. The real distinction people drew was not between clean and corrupt candidates, but between corruption hidden well and corruption clumsy enough to be prosecuted. The law meant to stop this. The Lex Julia de Ambitu was tightened again and again because earlier versions kept failing. Convicted candidates could be barred from office for years, yet the incentive to buy a magistracy anyway remained overwhelming, since the office itself unlocked provincial commands and contracts worth many times the bribe. Julius Caesar reportedly went so deeply into debt, securing early offices, that, departing for a provincial posting, he was said to have remarked he needed to make his fortune simply to pay what he already owed. If it was meant as a joke, it barely qualified as one. What made this arrangement normal, in the everyday Roman sense, was that everyone understood the system worked this way and planned accordingly from the start. Young senators calculated years in advance which offices to pursue, how much borrowing each stage required, and which province might later repay the investment. Corruption was not a deviation from Roman political life, it was the archetype. Number 40. Buying a wet nurse's silence. No. Buying a rival's crops. In the countryside surrounding Rome, wealthy landowners sometimes settled disputes with neighboring farmers, not through the courts, but by quietly diverting water. Aqueducts and irrigation channels ran across private and public land alike, and control over even a small feeder stream could mean the difference between a thriving vineyard and a ruined one. Roman law technically protected water rights through easements called servitudes, allowing a farmer to draw water across a neighbor's land under agreed terms, but enforcement depended entirely on local magistrates, who were often the same men who owned the largest estates nearby. A smaller farmer who found his channel blocked, silted, or simply rerouted overnight had little practical recourse, complaining to an official who dined regularly with the man responsible for the theft. Roman agricultural writers like Columella wrote with obvious frustration about boundary stones being moved a few feet at a time over the years, slowly annexing a neighbor's field into someone else's property. Land surveyors, called agrimensors, were sometimes bribed to redraw those boundaries on official records, making an illegal seizure look like a paperwork correction. It was theft committed in plain sight, disguised as bureaucracy, and rarely punished, since the victims were usually the ones with the least power to challenge it. Number 41. Buying a magistrate's silence with grain. In the Roman Republic, and later under the Empire, control of the grain supply was one of the most quietly effective forms of political leverage available to a wealthy citizen. Rome's urban population depended almost entirely on imported grain, shipped in from provinces like Egypt and North Africa, and stored in vast public granaries known as horia. Whoever controlled access to those granaries during a shortage held enormous unofficial power over magistrates, aediles, and even the city's food distribution officials. Wealthy grain merchants and politically connected landowners were known to deliberately withhold shipments or slow their release into the market, driving prices upward until the right official agreed to look the other way on a customs fee, a contract irregularity, or a debt owed to a powerful patron. In return for a well-timed release of grain during a public panic, a magistrate might quietly approve a contract, forgive an import tax, or simply forget to investigate a fraudulent weight on the scales. Cicero himself complained about officials who profited from engineered scarcity, noting how easily hunger in the streets could be converted into political currency in private negotiations. The system worked precisely because it never had to be called a bribe. It was simply called supply and demand, managed by men who understood that feeding or starving a city was its own form of currency, far more persuasive than coin, and far harder to trace back to any single decision. Number 42. Faking omens to stop a vote in the Roman Republic. Before any assembly of citizens could pass a law or elect a magistrate, an official augur was expected to observe the sky for signs of the gods' approval, most often watching the flight patterns of birds. This practice, called auspicia, was treated with genuine religious seriousness by many Romans. But it was also, quite openly, a political weapon. A magistrate, opposed to a particular vote or law, could simply announce that he was watching the sky for omens, a legal move known as obnuntiatio, and by that announcement alone force the proceedings to halt. No actual bad omen needed to appear. The mere declaration of watching was enough to freeze the entire political process, sometimes for the rest of the day, sometimes indefinitely. The most famous user of this trick was Julius Caesar's own political rival, Bibulus, who during his consulship simply retreated to his house and declared he was watching the heavens for months at a time, attempting to invalidate nearly everything Caesar tried to pass that year. Romans joked bitterly that the year was governed not by the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus, but simply by Caesar, since Bibulus had made himself irrelevant by hiding behind sacred procedure. Religious law, meant to protect the God's will, had become a bureaucratic stalling tactic, one that everyone recognized as political theater, even as they were legally bound to obey it. Number 43. Buying a magistracy through debt. In the final decades of the Roman Republic, seeking high office had become an almost purely financial gamble. A candidate for a position like praetor or consul was expected to fund elaborate games, distribute gifts to voting blocks, and pay off the professional vote brokers already normalized in Roman elections. Few aspiring politicians had this kind of wealth sitting in reserve, so they borrowed it, often from senators, financiers, or even foreign client kings eager to place a future favor with someone who might soon govern a province. The debts involved could be staggering, sometimes amounting to many times a family's entire annual income. Cicero himself wrote with some alarm about colleagues buried so deeply in borrowed money that losing an election would have meant total financial ruin, not just political embarrassment. This turned Roman elections into something closer to a leveraged investment scheme than a civic exercise. A winning candidate wasn't just gaining prestige, he was securing the only realistic mechanism he had left to repay his creditors, which was a provincial governorship, where taxation, requisitioning, and outright extortion could recoup the campaign's cost many times over. Losing, on the other hand, could mean exile, disgrace, or financial collapse severe enough to end a family's standing for a generation. Roman writers understood this cycle clearly, even as it continued unbroken. Election spending fed provincial extortion. Extortion fed further campaign spending. And the courts meant to punish the worst offenders were, as already seen, frequently compromised by the same money moving through the same networks. It was a closed loop that most of the political class simply accepted as the ordinary cost of a public career. Number 44. Buying an election outright. In the closing decades of the Republic, it was entirely possible for a Roman citizen to purchase a magistracy without ever appearing in public or giving a single speech. Wealthy men who had no interest in political life sometimes bought their way into minor offices simply to gain the social prestige attached to the title, or to protect family business interests that depended on having a friendly magistrate somewhere in the system. The going rate for these arrangements was not whispered about in secret. It was negotiated through agents whose entire profession was matching buyers with brokers who controlled blocks of tribal votes. Cicero himself complained, in letters to close friends, that honest candidates could no longer compete against rivals who simply purchased the numbers they needed, tribe by tribe, as though buying up shares in a company. What made this especially normalized was the layer of plausible deniability built into the system. A candidate rarely handed over coin himself. Instead, payments moved through several intermediaries, each one distancing the buyer from the transaction, so that even when everyone in the forum understood exactly what had happened, no single link in the chain could be prosecuted with any real evidence. Laws against this kind of purchase existed on paper for generations, yet the fines were treated by wealthy families as a routine cost of doing business, no more alarming than a shipping tax. Number 45. Selling a triumph. In the closing years of the Republic, even the honor of a military triumph, that grand procession through Rome, reserved for a victorious general, could be quietly negotiated behind closed doors. A commander returning from a campaign needed the Senate's formal approval to celebrate one, and that approval technically rested on strict criteria: a certain number of enemy dead, territory secured, a war properly declared and concluded. In practice, senators weighing the vote could be lobbied, flattered, or paid to look past inconvenient details. Generals padded casualty figures, exaggerated the scale of minor skirmishes, and distributed gifts to the very officials who would later judge whether their victory qualified. Pliny the Elder and other writers noted, with some disdain, how triumphs were requested for campaigns that barely deserved the name. Wars stretched thin on paper to meet the numeric thresholds required, cash gifts to senators, promises of future political support, and lavish entertaining all functioned as informal currency in these negotiations. A triumph brought immense prestige, a permanent place in the public memory of Rome. Statues, inscriptions, the honorific title added to a family's name for generations. Given stakes that high, few generals were above quietly nudging the process along. By the late Republic, the spectacle had become almost as political as it was military. A reminder that even Rome's most sacred ceremonies of glory were not immune to the same quiet arrangements that shaped its courts and its elections. Number 46. Buying a priesthood. In the Roman world, religious office was not always earned through devotion or study, but through outright purchase. Certain priesthoods, particularly minor ones tied to local cults or civic religious colleges, could be bought by wealthy men eager for the social prestige and political visibility the position carried. A priesthood placed a man visibly at public sacrifices, processions, and festivals, seen by thousands of citizens who might later vote for him in an election. The office also came with practical benefits beyond appearance. Many priesthoods granted access to temple funds, control over sacred lands, and a say in when certain religious observances, convenient religious observances, might delay or accelerate a political vote. A magistrate, who also held a priesthood, could sometimes invoke religious authority to interrupt proceedings that threatened his allies, blending sacred duty with raw political leverage in a single office. Wealthy families competed for these positions, much as they competed for magistracies, using influence, gifts, and quiet arrangements with the priestly colleges responsible for selection. Cicero himself wrote with visible discomfort about how thoroughly religious titles had become entangled with ambition and money. For many Romans, a priesthood was simply another rung on the political ladder, its sacred function almost secondary to the doors it opened in the Senate and the Forum. Number 47. The forged auspices of the augurs. In Roman religion, the College of Augurs held the power to read the will of the gods in the flight patterns of birds, in flashes of lightning, or in the way sacred chickens ate their feed before a battle. This practice, called taking the auspices, was treated as a genuine safeguard against acting without divine approval. But by the late Republic, the office had become something else entirely, a mechanism that ambitious men learned to manipulate rather than obey. Augurs were often drawn from the same aristocratic families competing for power, which meant the person interpreting the god's will and the person benefiting from that interpretation were frequently allies, or even the same family. If a general wanted to march on a particular day, an augur friendly to his cause might simply declare the omens favorable, regardless of what the birds actually did. If a political rival needed to be stopped, a hostile reading could be produced instead, halting an assembly entirely on the grounds that the signs were bad. There's a well-known anecdote about a Roman commander who, before a naval battle, was told the sacred chickens refused to eat, a terrible omen. His reported response was to have them thrown overboard, remarking that if they wouldn't eat, they could drink instead. He lost the battle badly afterward, and Roman writers loved retelling the story as proof that mocking the auspices invited disaster. Yet the deeper irony rarely discussed is that manipulating the auspices in one's favor, rather than mocking them outright, was rarely punished at all. It was simply how business was done. Cicero himself, who served as an augur, wrote privately that he doubted the whole system had much to do with genuine divination, and suspected most augurs privately shared his skepticism. Public religious authority, in other words, had quietly become a tool of statecraft, wielded by men who no longer needed to believe in it to make full use of it. Number 48. The sacred chickens who decided battles. In the Roman military, No commander was supposed to engage the enemy without first consulting the pulli sacri, a cage of sacred chickens kept by an officer called the pullarius. Before a battle, the chickens were offered grain, and their manner of eating was read as a divine verdict. If the birds ate eagerly, letting grain spill from their beaks, the omen was considered excellent, and the attack could proceed. If they refused to eat or ate half-heartedly, Roman commanders were expected to delay or cancel their plans entirely, regardless of tactical circumstances. In practice, the system was riddled with quiet manipulation. Commanders eager to fight simply starved the chickens beforehand, guaranteeing a hungry, enthusiastic feeding response, no matter the actual military situation. The historian accounts surrounding the First Punic War preserve one especially notorious episode in which the consul Publius Claudius Pulcher told that the sacred chickens would not eat before a naval battle near Drepana, reportedly ordered them thrown overboard, remarking that if they would not eat, then let them drink. He lost the battle badly afterward, and Roman writers treated the story for generations as a cautionary tale about arrogance toward the gods. What makes the practice so revealing is not simply that it could be rigged, but that everyone seemed to understand it could be rigged, and the ritual persisted anyway. The chickens were not really a mechanism for detecting divine will, so much as a shared civic language, a formal excuse that let commanders justify decisions they had often already made. Roman religion, at least in its public military form, left considerable room for humans to keep their hands on the controls, while still appearing to defer to the will of the gods. Number 49. Trial by public opinion in the Forum. In Rome, a person's fate could hinge less on evidence than on the mood of a crowd gathered in the Forum. Certain trials, particularly those involving public figures, were held in open spaces where onlookers pressed close enough to shout, jeer, or cheer as arguments unfolded. Orators understood this well, and men like Cicero shaped their speeches not only for judges and jurors, but for the swelling crowd behind them, whose noise could unsettle a magistrate or embolden an accuser. A defendant might arrive escorted by weeping relatives and children dressed in mourning clothes, hoping to visibly stir sympathy before a single argument was spoken. Wealthy defendants sometimes paid claques, groups of people scattered through the audience, whose only task was to applaud on cue, creating the illusion of widespread public support. The trial, in this sense, was as much theater as law, judgment shaped by performance and crowd emotion as much as by fact. What stands out, looking back across all of this, is not that Rome was uniquely cruel or corrupt. It's that so much of what unsettles us now, the manipulation, the spectacle, the quiet cruelties folded into daily life, was, to the people living it, simply ordinary. History rarely announces itself as history while it's happening. It just feels, to those inside it, like an Number 50. The sacred geese, who almost weren't enough, in 390 BC, or thereabouts. Roman writers claimed the sacred geese kept near the temple of Juno, on the Capitoline Hill, had done what the army's own watchdogs failed to do. They woke the garrison when Gallic raiders tried to scale the hill under cover of night. The dogs, the story goes, stayed silent and were punished for it every year afterward in a strange little ritual. A dog was crucified on a cross of elder wood and paraded through the city, while a goose, dressed in fine purple and gold cushions, was carried in honor through the streets. Nobody today can confirm how literally the Romans took this tale by the time it was being retold centuries later. Livy himself seemed to record it with a certain distance, the way one repeats a story from childhood without quite vouching for it. But the ritual persisted, generation after generation, a small civic memory of gratitude and shame performed in public, geese honored, dogs blamed, for an event that may have grown taller with each retelling. It says something about Rome, that even its animals carried moral weight in public memory, that loyalty and failure were staged, year after year, as if the city needed to keep reminding itself which stories it had chosen to believe. 50 things, in the end, and none of them separate from each other. The poisonings and the bribery, the crowded baths and the borrowed money, the sacred chickens and the sacred geese, all of it lived in the same Rome, often in the same afternoon, sometimes in the same person. What feels strange from this distance rarely felt strange to the people living it. It simply felt like Tuesday, and perhaps that's the quiet, useful thing to carry away from all this. That normal has never been a fixed thing, only ever what a given people, in a given century, has learned not to notice anymore. Number 51. The forgotten graves beneath the city. Beneath the busy streets of modern Rome, layer upon layer of the ancient city still rests, largely undisturbed, simply because no one has ever needed to dig deep enough to find it. Entire apartment blocks, shops, and shrines were not destroyed by some single dramatic collapse, but were slowly buried over centuries by flooding silt from the Tiber, by rubble left where it fell, by new floors laid directly over old ones, again and again, until the ground itself rose meters above where people once walked. Much of what is known about daily Roman life, the graffiti on tavern walls, the bones left in kitchen middens, the small clay lamps dropped and never retrieved, survives only because it was quietly covered, rather than deliberately preserved. No one was thinking of future historians. They were simply living, then leaving, then being built over by people who were doing the same thing. There is something quieting in that thought. So much of what has been described across this list, the cruelty, the corruption, the strange tenderness alongside the violence, was never recorded because anyone thought it remarkable. It was recorded, if at all, by accident. A tax receipt, a curse scratched into lead, a child's tooth swapped for one taken from the dead. Ordinary life rarely announces itself as historically significant while it is happening. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson underneath all 51 of these fragments. What feels unremarkable now, the routines, the small daily arrangements no one questions, will one day seem just as distant, just as strange, to someone who was never there to understand why it made sense at the time. Number 52. The disappearing archive. Beyond the accidents of burial and mud, there is something quieter worth sitting with. How much of Rome simply vanished on purpose, or through plain neglect, long before any volcano or flood had a chance to preserve anything. Papyrus scrolls, the primary format for most Roman writing, decayed within a few generations, unless painstakingly recopied by hand. Entire libraries in Rome burned during civil wars, palace fires, and the slow institutional neglect that followed the empire's own decline. Whole bodies of Roman law, poetry, and private letters exist today only as titles mentioned in someone else's surviving footnote, a scholar quoting a line from a book long gone, a lawyer referencing a statute whose original text never made it this far. What remains, then, is not really a full portrait of Rome. It is a portrait of what happened to survive Rome, which sponges and collars, which curse tablets and courtroom speeches, which scraps of gossip scratched onto broken pottery happened to land somewhere dark, dry, and undisturbed for 2,000 years. The ordinary and the shocking survived by the same blind luck. A dinner invitation had the same odds of enduring as a death sentence. Perhaps that is the quiet thought worth carrying out of all this. Every era believes its own normal is simply how the world works, unremarkable, permanent, hardly worth writing down with any care. Rome believed that too. Number 53. The silence of the ordinary. Beyond the poisonings and the bribery, beyond the courtrooms and the arenas, there is a quieter truth about Rome that rarely makes it into any list at all. Most Romans left behind nothing resembling a record. No name carved in stone, no letter preserved in ash, no mention in any surviving text. The men who bribed juries and the governors who bled provinces dry are known precisely because their crimes were large enough, or public enough, to be written down by someone with the means to write. But the vast majority of people living under that same empire, a farmer near Numidia, a weaver in Ostia, a child sold quietly and never spoken of again, simply vanished from memory the moment they died. Not because their lives lacked meaning, but because meaning was never what determined survival. Only accident did. A sealed jar, a buried villa, a scrap of papyrus used to stuff a mummy wrapping centuries later, forgotten and rediscovered by chance. What remains of Rome, in the end, is less a record of how people lived than a record of what happened to survive them. And somewhere in that gap, in everything never written down, is the ordinary, unremarkable life of almost everyone who ever breathed within that empire. Perhaps that absence deserves to be remembered too. Number 54. The silence of the stones. Walking today among the ruins of the Forum, or along the cracked paving stones of some forgotten provincial road, it is easy to forget how much of what shaped those places was never written down at all. The laws, the trials, the scandals, the poisonings and bribes and burials alive, these survived because someone, somewhere, thought them worth recording, or because a fire happened to spare a scroll, or because a wall happened to collapse in a way that sealed a room shut for 2,000 years. But so much of Roman life was never spoken of as remarkable in the first place. A farmer mending a fence, a mother teaching a child to weave, a soldier riding home, homesick, on a scrap of wood, never expecting anyone but his family to read it. These moments were not scandalous enough to be condemned, nor important enough to be praised. They simply happened, the way most of life simply happens, and then they were gone. It is worth sitting with that thought for a moment, that an empire capable of such spectacle, such cruelty, such elaborate corruption and ceremony, was still, underneath all of it, made mostly of quiet, unremarkable days. Most Romans were not senators bribing juries or generals rigging omens. They were simply people, living inside a world whose rules seem monstrous now, often without ever questioning them, because it was the only world they had ever known. Perhaps that, more than any single custom or law, is the strangest thing of all, how normal any age can feel. From the inside, no matter what it looks like from the outside. Centuries later. Number 55. The silence of the archives. Historians who study Rome often speak of a strange kind of humility that comes from the work itself. For every inscription that survives, thousands more crumbled into dust, unread by anyone. Their words lost before they were ever transcribed. For every named senator whose life is documented in letters and speeches, there were millions of Romans whose names appear nowhere at all, not on tombstones, not on tax rolls, not in the fragments of census records that happen to endure. What remains today is less like a mirror of Roman life, and more like a handful of sand, pulled from a beach the size of a continent. The historians who study it know this. They speak, often, of absence as much as presence, of the letters never written by people who could not read, of the meals never described because eating was simply eating, of the 10,000 ordinary nights that left no trace because nothing about them seemed worth writing down. And so the 50 things gathered here, strange as they may seem now, were never chosen by Rome to represent itself. They survived by chance, a law preserved because a later empire needed it, a joke preserved because it was scratched into a wall, a scandal preserved because someone powerful wanted it remembered against an enemy. The ordinary Roman, going about an ordinary day, never imagined being watched across 2,000 years. They were not performing for history. They were simply living, the way people always have, inside a world that felt, to them, entirely unremarkable. Number 56. The silence of the ordinary among everything Rome left behind. One absence stands out more than any single fact: the near total silence surrounding the lives of children, who were neither enslaved nor noble, neither criminal nor emperor, but simply present. No letters from a Roman child survive in any meaningful number, no diary, no drawing, no small complaint scratched into wax that historians can point to and say, "This was an ordinary afternoon in an ordinary young life." What is known about Roman childhood comes almost entirely through adult eyes, legal codes describing what a father could do, epitaphs composed by grieving parents, medical writers commenting on illness from a clinical distance. A handful of toys have survived in graves, small terracotta dolls, gaming pieces worn smooth by handling. They suggest play, affection, boredom on an ordinary day. But they cannot speak. They cannot say what a child believed, feared, or hoped for. It is easy, across so many chapters of cruelty and corruption and strange belief, to imagine Rome as fundamentally unlike anywhere lived in now. And in many legal and structural ways it was. But beneath the laws and the customs, there were still mornings that felt unremarkable to the people living them. A meal eaten without ceremony. A walk through a street that felt permanent because no one imagined it would one day lie buried under layers of earth. Almost none of that ordinary texture survives. Not because it was hidden, but because no one thought to preserve a feeling so common. It seemed it would simply always be there. Number 57. The silence of the ordinary voice. Beyond even the silence of children, there is a wider, quieter silence that stretches across almost all of Roman society. The voice of the ordinary adult, living an ordinary life, who left behind no name at all. Historians estimate that the vast majority of people who lived under Roman rule, farmers, weavers, dockworkers, bakers, mothers tending small households, appear in no surviving text whatsoever. Not because their lives lacked meaning, but because meaning in the ancient world was rarely something recorded for its own sake. Writing was expensive. Papyrus decayed. Stone was reserved for those who could afford to be remembered. What survives instead is a strange, uneven residue. A rich man's boastful epitaph, a senator's letter, a legal dispute over a will, the ordinary rhythm underneath all of it, the actual texture of getting up, working, eating, loving, aging, mostly dissolved long before anyone thought to preserve it. It leaves behind a quiet kind of humility for anyone studying this world now. So much of what is called Roman history is really the history of Roman exception. The wealthy, the literate, the powerful. The rest survive only in fragments, in the shape of a worn doorstep, a broken cup, and names scratched once into plaster and never explained. Perhaps that absence is its own kind of lesson, that most lives, in any era, pass without record, and that ordinariness itself was never the failure. It was simply never built to last. Number 58. The silence of the archives, even Rome's laws, so carefully preserved in stone and legal code, describe a world that no longer answers back. Historians can read what was permitted, what was punished, what was expected, but the tone of a mother's voice, the private doubts of a soldier, the quiet resentment of a shopkeeper toward a corrupt magistrate, none of that survives in any reliable form. What remains is structure, not feeling. This is easy to forget, because the structure is so detailed. Rome left behind contracts, tax registers, courtroom transcripts, funeral inscriptions. It can feel, at times, like an almost complete picture, but completeness of documentation is not the same as completeness of understanding. A law against bribery says nothing about whether the person following it felt ashamed, or amused, or afraid. Modern readers often reach for judgment when they encounter Roman life, calling it cruel, or corrupt, or strange, and by many standards, much of it was. But judgment requires imagining an inner life that the historical record almost never provides. The Romans who lived these customs did not experience them as scandalous history. They experienced them as Tuesday, as dinner, as the ordinary weight of an ordinary week, unremarkable enough that no one thought to explain it to the future. Perhaps that is the last, quiet lesson in all of this. Not that Rome was uniquely brutal, or uniquely bribed, or uniquely strange, but that every era carries habits it cannot see clearly from the inside, and every era, eventually, becomes someone else's distant, half-legible past. Number 59. The silence of ordinary voices. Even now, after so many hours spent moving through the strange and often unsettling texture of Roman daily life, it's worth pausing on something quieter than any single fact, the sheer scale of what simply never made it into the record at all. Most people who lived in Rome, across all those centuries, left behind no name, no letter, no inscription, not because their lives lacked meaning to the people around them, but because meaning, at the time, rarely felt like something worth writing down. A mother humming to a child, a neighbor's small kindness during a hard winter, an old joke repeated so often it stopped needing an origin. These things didn't require permanence, because no one imagined a future audience listening in 2,000 years later. Historians often describe the past as a puzzle with missing pieces. But that framing can be misleading. It suggests a whole picture once existed, waiting to be reassembled. In truth, most of that picture was never drawn in the first place. What survives? A legal code here, a broken lamp there, a curse tablet scratched in frustration, or fragments of a much larger silence, one that was never meant to be filled. There's something oddly calming in that thought. So much of what felt urgent, dramatic, or scandalous in Roman life has faded into the quiet, along with everything gentle and unremarkable. What remains is not the full truth of Rome, only the faint outline of it, enough to wonder about, never quite enough. Number 60. The quiet ordinariness of an ending. Bring this list to its final point, and something becomes clear that has nothing to do with poison, or bribery, or blood in the arena. It is that the strangeness of Rome was never really the point. Beneath every unsettling custom catalogued here, there were simply people going about lives that felt, to them, entirely unremarkable. A mother arranging a marriage for her daughter did not experience herself as a figure in a shocking historical footnote. A juror accepting a bribe did not feel the weight of centuries watching him. A vendor selling watered wine at a street counter was thinking, most likely, about the next customer, not about how his small transaction would one day be reconstructed from a few broken shards of pottery. The distance that makes these things seem strange now is only time. It was not strangeness to them. That, perhaps, is the quiet lesson tucked inside 50 or 60 scattered facts. Every era believes its own habits to be simply how life is done, ordinary, unremarkable, hardly worth writing down. Rome believed that too, and in another 2,000 years, someone else may look back at some ordinary habit of this century, something no one alive today thinks twice about, and find it just as difficult to understand. History, in the end, is not a record of what people found strange. It is only ever what happened to survive of what people found normal. And that's where we leave it for tonight. Wherever you are, however heavy your eyes have gotten, there's nothing else you need to do right now. Just let it all go.